You thought the mining camps were bad. You thought sleeping in mud and eating beans for every meal was rock bottom. But what happens when desperation builds a town? What happens when hundreds of broken men with nothing left to lose create their own version of civilization? Welcome to episode 4 of our California Gold Rush series. You're about to discover that there's something worse than failing to find gold. It's succeeding just enough to stay trapped. Because today, you're living in a boomtown where a simple meal costs a week's wages, where your neighbors would kill you for a handful of dust, and where the only thriving businesses are the ones that profit from human misery. Close your eyes and smell the smoke, the waste, the desperation, cooking in the California sun. Feel the weight of a loaded gun in your pocket, because trust is a luxury you can't afford. You're about to learn that when civilization collapses, what grows in its place isn't always better than what came before. The architecture of desperation. The town that emerges around the mining camps develops according to principles that prioritize speed and profit over safety, comfort, or any consideration for human beings who must live within structures thrown together by people who understand construction less than they understand desperation. Buildings rise overnight using materials salvaged from abandoned wagons, canvas stretched over inadequate frames, and lumber cut from trees that were never meant to support human habitation. Your new shelter consists of a space rented in a structure that might charitably be called a boarding house, though it provides neither the amenities nor the privacy that civilized people associate with temporary accommodation. The walls don't reach the ceiling, creating acoustic transparency that makes every conversation audible to neighbors who share similar spaces divided by barriers that exist more in theory than in practice. The floor consists of packed earth covered with boards that don't fit together properly, creating gaps that allow mud, moisture, and cold to penetrate what should provide basic protection from elements that California weather delivers with unpredictable intensity. Your sleeping area measures barely enough space to lie down, with no room for personal possessions or the privacy that normal human beings require for basic dignity. Ventilation occurs through gaps in construction rather than planned openings, creating drafts that make heating impossible while failing to provide adequate air circulation for the number of people crowded into spaces designed for perhaps half the current occupancy. The smell of unwashed bodies, cooking food, and human waste concentrates in enclosed areas that can't be properly cleaned or maintained. The buildings lean against each other for structural support that individual construction can't provide, creating neighborhoods where the failure of one structure could bring down entire blocks of similarly inadequate housing that shelters hundreds of men who have no alternative arrangements available within their financial means. Fire represents constant threat as heating, cooking, and lighting all require open flames in structures built from materials that would ignite quickly and burn completely, spreading destruction through communities where firefighting capabilities consist of bucket brigades organized by residents who may or may not be present when disaster strikes. You begin to understand how quickly human settlements can devolve into conditions that would horrify civilized observers while seeming normal to people who have no experience with proper planning, adequate resources, or community institutions that normally govern urban development. The economics of exploitation. Every service and commodity in the boomtown costs multiples of what similar items would cost in civilized locations, not because of transportation expenses or genuine scarcity, but because merchants understand that desperate customers have no alternatives and therefore no ability to negotiate reasonable prices for essential goods and services. A simple meal consisting of beans, hardtack, and coffee costs more than you used to spend on groceries for several days, served under conditions that would violate health standards in any civilized community but represent normal dining experience in locations where competition doesn't exist, and customer satisfaction becomes irrelevant to business success. Laundry services charge fees equivalent to buying new clothes in normal markets, though the cleaning occurs under conditions that often return garments in worse condition than when they were submitted for washing. The lack of proper facilities, adequate water, and appropriate materials means that paying for cleaning often damages clothing while failing to remove the accumulated filth that makes such services necessary. Tools and equipment cost 3 to 5 times their normal value, despite quality that often proves inferior to what would be available in established communities, where merchants must compete for customers who have choices about where to spend their money and therefore demand value for their purchases. Medical attention commands prices that reflect the scarcity of qualified practitioners and the desperate need for care that results from living conditions that cause injury and illness with predictable regularity. Even basic treatment for minor problems costs enough to eliminate weeks of careful savings from mining activities that rarely produce significant income. Housing rental fees consume most of whatever gold gets extracted from claims that produce barely enough to cover basic survival expenses, creating economic cycles where working harder simply allows continued existence rather than accumulation of wealth that could support families or eventual return to civilized living conditions. Credit becomes available at interest rates that ensure permanent indebtedness for anyone desperate enough to accept such terms, while alternative financing doesn't exist for people whose only collateral consists of mining claims that may or may not produce enough gold to service existing obligations, much less generate surplus wealth. The entire economic system seems designed to transfer whatever wealth miners extract directly to merchants who never engage in actual mining but profit consistently from other people's labor and impossible dreams of California success. The texture of lawlessness. Formal law enforcement doesn't exist in any recognizable form, creating conditions where disputes get resolved through mechanisms that favor physical strength, willingness to use violence, or simple ability to outlast opponents in conflicts that civilized society would handle through legal institutions and established procedures for peaceful resolution. Your personal safety depends on avoiding conflicts rather than relying on community protection, as the informal justice system that develops operates through vigilante committees whose decisions reflect the immediate emotions and personal interests of whoever happens to be present when problems arise, rather than consistent application of principles that protect individual rights. Theft occurs regularly, despite the desperate circumstances that make everyone understand how losing essential possessions could prove fatal in an environment where replacement costs exceed most people's financial capabilities. The psychology of survival creates logic where taking from others seems more reasonable than accepting personal failure in venture that has already consumed enormous investments. Arguments escalate quickly to physical confrontation when exhaustion, hunger, and constant stress eliminate the patience and social restraint that normally allow civilized resolution of disagreements between people with competing interests or different perspectives about fair distribution of limited resources and opportunities. Weapons become visible accessories rather than concealed tools, as men understand that displaying capacity for violence may prevent conflicts more effectively than relying on community standards or legal institutions that don't exist in forms adequate for maintaining order among populations stressed beyond normal human tolerance for hardship. The informal rules that develop favor those with established relationships, superior resources, or simply better understanding of how power operates in communities where traditional authority doesn't exist, and new forms of social organization emerge through processes that often resemble warfare more than civilized governance. Women exist in small numbers and vulnerable circumstances that make their safety dependent on male protection, that may or may not prove reliable when tested by conditions that eliminate normal social constraints and reduce human interaction to calculations about individual survival versus community welfare. You learn to sleep lightly and keep essential possessions within reach, understanding that relaxing vigilance could invite problems from neighbors who face identical pressures and might conclude that survival justifies actions that would be unthinkable under normal circumstances where basic needs don't require constant attention. The rhythm of vice. Alcohol becomes the primary social institution in Boomtown life, providing temporary escape from conditions that would drive sober men to despair, while creating new problems that compound the existing challenges of survival in an environment designed to break human spirits through systematic deprivation and constant stress. The saloons operate continuously, serving liquor of questionable quality, at prices that consume whatever modest profits miners extract from claims that rarely produce enough gold to justify the enormous physical and emotional costs of extraction. Drinking becomes both recreation and economic suicide, but the immediate relief feels more important than long-term financial planning. Your tolerance for alcohol adjusts to accommodate circumstances where intoxication provides the only available method for managing pain, anxiety, and despair that result from living conditions that exceed normal human capacity for endurance. Sobriety becomes too difficult to maintain when consciousness includes full awareness of how completely this venture has failed. Gambling follows drinking with mathematical inevitability, as men seek ways to transform small amounts of gold dust into larger amounts through games that favor house operators who understand probability better than desperate players who need miraculous improvement in circumstances that show no sign of changing through ordinary effort. The gaming tables create illusions of opportunity that feel more realistic than actual mining prospects, because card games and dice offer immediate results rather than the gradual disappointment that characterizes months of processing, tons of earth to extract tiny quantities of precious metal that barely cover survival expenses. Prostitution emerges as the most reliable economy in communities where normal social relationships can't develop under conditions that reduce human interaction to basic survival concerns, and eliminate the stability, privacy, and emotional security that intimate relationships require for healthy development between civilized people. Your moral standards adjust to accommodate reality, where judgment becomes luxury that survival can't afford, and behaviors that would have seemed shocking during your previous life become normal aspects of community existence that everyone accepts because alternatives don't exist for people trapped in circumstances beyond their control. The cycle of work, drink, gamble, and despair creates daily routine that provides structure when normal social institutions don't exist, though the pattern leads consistently toward deeper poverty and degradation, rather than improvement in circumstances that originally motivated this entire venture. The mathematics of degradation. Your daily routine reduces to mechanical repetition that serves no purpose except continued existence in circumstances where survival becomes an end in itself rather than means toward achieving goals that once seemed achievable through hard work and determination under conditions that proved fundamentally different from advertised opportunities. Sleep occurs in shifts determined by noise levels that make rest impossible during peak activity hours when hundreds of men pursue various forms of temporary escape from conditions that sober reflection would make unbearable for people who remember what normal human existence should include. Meals consist of whatever can be prepared quickly and consumed efficiently without attention to nutrition, taste, or social significance that food normally provides in civilized communities, where eating serves purposes beyond simple caloric intake needed to fuel continued physical function. Personal hygiene becomes impossible to maintain, despite understanding that cleanliness affects health, social acceptance, and basic human dignity in ways that matter even when other aspects of civilized existence have been abandoned due to circumstances that eliminate choice about how to live. Your appearance deteriorates in ways that would have been unthinkable during your previous life when clothing, grooming, and general presentation reflected social status and personal character rather than simple survival under conditions that destroy everything except basic biological function. Time loses normal meaning as days blend together without the variety, social markers, or sense of progress that usually distinguish one day from another in lives that include purposes beyond immediate survival in hostile environment that offers no rewards for maintaining civilized standards. The farmer's condition continues declining despite rest periods that the group can barely afford, and medical attention that costs more than available resources can support, without eliminating other essential expenses that determine whether basic survival continues to be possible. Your relationship with money changes fundamentally as currency becomes tool for extending survival rather than means for accumulating wealth or purchasing improvements in living conditions that don't exist in forms that money can buy under current circumstances, where desperation drives all economic relationships. The sound of breakdown. Conversations around you occur in voices that carry undertones of violence, desperation, and mental instability that result from months or years of living under conditions that push human psychological tolerance beyond limits that healthy minds can endure without developing symptoms that would concern medical professionals. Your own speech patterns adapt to communicate essential information quickly and clearly, while avoiding topics or tones that might trigger conflicts with men whose emotional stability has been compromised by experiences that would traumatize people who grew up expecting life to include basic security and social support. Arguments escalate with frightening speed, from minor disagreements about practical matters to potentially fatal confrontations between people who have lost the social skills and emotional restraint that normally allow civilized resolution of conflicts that arise naturally when humans live in close proximity. The sounds of construction, destruction, and constant activity create background noise that makes concentration impossible and rest difficult even during brief periods when you're not actively engaged in survival activities that demand constant attention to immediate physical and economic needs. Music, when it occurs, tends toward melancholy songs that express emotions too dangerous to discuss directly among men who can't afford to acknowledge the depth of their disappointment and despair about ventures that have consumed years of their lives without producing promised results. Laughter becomes rare, and often carries hysterical undertones that suggest psychological pressure rather than genuine amusement, as circumstances eliminate most sources of legitimate pleasure or satisfaction that normally contribute to mental health and social bonding between people sharing common experiences. The constant background awareness of potential violence affects every interaction, creating social atmosphere where casual conversation requires careful attention to avoid accidentally triggering responses that could prove dangerous when delivered by people whose emotional stability has been compromised by prolonged exposure to impossible circumstances. You develop sensitivity to vocal cues that indicate when someone's mental state has moved beyond normal frustration into territory where rational discussion becomes impossible and physical retreat becomes necessary for personal safety in environment, where help won't arrive if situations deteriorate beyond individual ability to manage them safely. The geography of waste. The boomtown grows without planning or consideration for basic sanitation, creating accumulations of human and industrial waste that pose health threats to everyone while serving as visible evidence of how quickly civilized standards disappear when survival takes precedence over community welfare and long-term thinking. Garbage accumulates in areas between buildings where no one takes responsibility for removal, creating breeding grounds for disease and pest infestations that affect entire neighborhoods of people who can't afford to relocate to cleaner areas that may not exist within their financial reach anyway. Human waste disposal occurs through methods that would horrify health officials in civilized communities, contaminating water sources and creating conditions that spread illness with predictable efficiency among populations already weakened by inadequate nutrition and constant physical stress that reduces natural resistance to infection. Mining operations leave behind massive piles of processed earth that serve no useful purpose while creating landscape features that redirect water flow, eliminate vegetation, and generally transform natural terrain into industrial wasteland that will require decades to recover even if restoration efforts ever begin. The air quality deteriorates constantly as fires burn continuously for heating, cooking, and industrial purposes, using fuel sources that produce smoke containing substances that irritate breathing and contribute to respiratory problems that affect nearly everyone exposed to such conditions for extended periods. Water becomes contaminated by mining runoff, human waste, and industrial activities that occur upstream from communities that depend on the same sources for drinking, cooking, and basic hygiene needs that civilized people normally assume will be protected by community planning and regulatory oversight. Dead animals accumulate in areas where disposal becomes someone else's problem, creating additional health hazards and unpleasant odors that contribute to general environmental degradation that makes living conditions worse for everyone, regardless of their individual efforts to maintain personal cleanliness and health. Your daily routine includes constant exposure to sights, sounds, and smells that would have been unthinkable during your previous life, in communities where basic public health measures protected residents from conditions that result when too many people live in too small an area without adequate infrastructure for managing the byproducts of human civilization. The texture of crowding. Privacy disappears entirely as hundreds of men live in closer proximity than families normally endure, creating constant awareness of other people's personal habits, bodily functions, and individual responses to stress that civilized society keeps private through architectural and social arrangements that don't exist under current circumstances. Your sleeping area provides no acoustic separation from neighbors who snore, cough, talk in their sleep, or engage in other nighttime activities that become public knowledge, despite everyone's desire for the personal space that normal human beings require for psychological health and basic dignity. Personal conversations become impossible to conduct without being overheard by people who may or may not be trustworthy with information that could affect your safety, financial security, or relationships with other community members who might use such knowledge for personal advantage rather than mutual benefit. Hygiene activities must be performed in public or semi-public spaces, where basic bodily functions become visible to strangers who share similar facilities designed for much smaller populations than currently depend on them for essential needs that civilized people normally handle privately. The constant presence of other people eliminates opportunities for solitude that healthy minds require for processing experiences, managing emotions, and maintaining the individual identity that develops through periods of reflection and personal space that simply don't exist under current living arrangements. Conflicts arise from minor irritations that will be manageable under normal circumstances, but become major problems when people can't escape from each other long enough to allow tensions to cool naturally through the separation that civilized communities provide automatically. Your tolerance for human proximity adjusts to accommodate conditions where personal space becomes luxury that survival can't afford, though the psychological cost of such adaptation affects mental health in ways that may prove permanent even if circumstances eventually improve. Social dynamics develop around the reality that individual behavior affects everyone within hearing or sight range, creating informal rules and expectations that attempt to make crowded conditions bearable while rarely achieving comfort levels that most people would consider adequate for long-term residence. The weight of permanence. The temporary structures and makeshift arrangements that once seemed like brief inconveniences during transition to better circumstances begin to feel permanent as months pass without improvement in conditions that originally appeared to be short-term hardships that would be resolved through persistence and hard work. Your plans for eventual return home with accumulated wealth fade into vague possibilities that seem increasingly disconnected from actual daily experience, in circumstances that consume whatever modest income gets generated while preventing accumulation of savings sufficient to support major life changes. The Boomtown develops characteristics of established community despite the obvious inadequacy of its infrastructure, institutions, and social arrangements that would need fundamental transformation to support healthy human civilization over extended periods of time. New arrivals continue appearing regularly, bringing fresh optimism and energy that contrasts sharply with the resignation and exhaustion visible among residents who have been testing these conditions long enough to understand their permanent rather than temporary nature. Your possessions adapt to reflect long-term residence rather than temporary accommodation, as items designed for brief camping become permanent furniture, and clothing selected for durability replaces garments chosen for appearance or comfort that don't serve practical needs under current circumstances. Relationships develop the complexity that characterizes stable communities rather than the casual associations typical of temporary gatherings, though the underlying conditions remain too harsh to support the kind of social development that creates genuine community institutions and cooperative progress. The farmer's illness progresses to stages that require decisions about long-term care rather than temporary treatment, forcing recognition that some consequences of this venture will persist regardless of whether mining activities eventually prove successful or whether return home becomes financially possible. Your mental adjustment to current circumstances includes acceptance that this may represent permanent rather than temporary change in life direction, requiring psychological adaptation to possibilities that would have seemed unthinkable when this venture began, with confidence about its temporary nature and eventual successful conclusion. The arithmetic of survival. Your daily expenses consistently exceed daily income by margins that make financial stability impossible, regardless of how hard you work or how carefully you manage the minimal resources that gold extraction provides, under conditions where success gets measured by avoiding complete disaster rather than achieving positive results. Food costs alone consume most of whatever gold dust accumulates from processing tons of earth that yield tiny quantities of precious metal, insufficient to support the lifestyle that originally motivated this venture. The mathematics reveal systematic problems that can't be solved through individual effort or improved technique. Housing expenses require most remaining income after food costs, leaving nothing for equipment, replacement, medical care, or the savings that would be necessary to support eventual return travel to civilized locations where normal economic relationships allow accumulation of wealth through reasonable effort and sound judgment. Credit becomes necessary for basic survival during periods when mining produces nothing of value, creating debt obligations that consume future income before it gets extracted from claims that may or may not continue producing even minimal amounts of gold sufficient to service existing financial commitments. The banker's methodical documentation reveals the mathematical impossibility of success under current conditions, even if gold extraction improves dramatically, as living expenses operate according to principles designed to transfer whatever wealth gets produced back to suppliers who never engage in actual mining. Medical costs create unpredictable financial crises that can eliminate months of careful saving through single episodes of illness or injury that result directly from working conditions that civilized labor practices would recognize as dangerous to basic human health and long-term physical capability. Equipment replacement costs continue escalating as tools wear out faster under harsh conditions, while lasting longer becomes impossible when repair services don't exist, and replacement parts must be transported across distances that make simple maintenance prohibitively expensive for people operating on subsistence budgets. Your economic situation deteriorates steadily, despite constant work and careful attention to expenses that would be considered reasonable in normal circumstances, where basic survival doesn't compete with every other financial consideration for limited resources that never seem adequate for essential needs. The democracy of desperation. Every person in the Boomtown faces similar financial pressures that eliminate normal social distinctions and create equality based on shared poverty rather than shared opportunity for advancement through cooperative effort and mutual assistance that characterizes healthy community development. The blacksmith's superior skills provide no significant advantage when everyone needs the same basic services while lacking money to pay for quality work, forcing him to compete on price rather than craftsmanship in markets where desperation drives all economic relationships toward minimal compensation for maximum effort. Your previous social status becomes irrelevant in an environment where survival depends on immediate practical capabilities rather than education, family connections, or business experience that seemed valuable during your comfortable life but prove worthless under conditions that reduce human worth to physical productivity. Professional distinctions disappear as doctors, lawyers, merchants, and farmers all perform identical manual labor for similar inadequate compensation, while competing for the same limited opportunities that rarely provide sufficient income to support the different lifestyle expectations that their training once seemed to guarantee. The banker's analytical skills offer no protection against economic conditions that operate according to principles that favor suppliers over workers, regardless of individual competence, education, or previous success in civilized business environments where merit receives appropriate compensation. Formal education proves useless for solving problems that require physical endurance, tolerance for discomfort, and acceptance of circumstances that educated people normally expect to improve through intelligent planning and systematic effort applied over reasonable time periods. Your ability to read, write, and calculate provides no advantage over illiterate men who adapt more easily to conditions that reward simple persistence rather than intellectual sophistication in an environment where thinking too clearly about circumstances might prove psychologically devastating. Social cooperation becomes difficult when everyone faces pressures that make individual survival more important than community welfare, creating conditions where mutual assistance competes with personal necessity in calculations that rarely favor group interests over immediate individual needs. The sound of broken dreams. Conversations about future plans become less frequent as the gap between original expectations and actual results grows too large to bridge through optimistic speculation about improvements that show no signs of materializing despite continued effort under increasingly difficult circumstances. Your fellow residents speak less about wealth and success, replacing such discussions with practical exchanges about survival strategies, health concerns, and minor improvements in daily routines that might make current conditions slightly more bearable without changing their fundamental nature. The few letters that arrive from home carry news about normal life progression that seems impossibly distant from your current reality. Where basic survival requires constant attention and successful completion of ordinary tasks becomes worthy of celebration rather than automatic expectation. Music, when it occurs, tends toward melancholy themes that express emotions too dangerous to discuss directly among men whose mental stability depends on avoiding full recognition of how completely their life plans have failed to produce promised results. Arguments become more frequent and intense as exhaustion, disappointment, and constant stress eliminate the patience and emotional control that normally allow civilized people to resolve conflicts through discussion rather than confrontation, that could prove dangerous in an environment where help won't arrive if situations escalate beyond individual ability to manage. The constant background noise of construction, industry, and human activity creates acoustic environment that makes rest difficult and concentration nearly impossible during brief periods when you're not actively engaged in survival activities that demand immediate attention to practical concerns. Your own voice changes when discussing personal goals or future possibilities, losing the confidence and enthusiasm that once characterized conversations about opportunities, and replacing them with careful neutrality that avoids commitment to outcomes. Sleep brings dreams about failure and loss rather than success and achievement, as your unconscious mind processes the accumulating evidence that years of life have been invested in pursuit of opportunities that may never have existed in forms described by promotional materials that motivated this venture. The texture of violence. Physical confrontations occur with increasing frequency as accumulated stress, disappointment, and desperation eliminate the social restraints that normally prevent minor disagreements from escalating to dangerous levels of conflict between people who have lost the emotional stability that civilized communities help maintain through institutional support. Your awareness of potential violence becomes constant background concern that affects every interaction with neighbors whose psychological condition has been compromised by experiences that would traumatize people who grew up expecting basic security and social cooperation rather than daily struggle for individual survival. Weapons appear more frequently in public spaces, as men understand that displaying capacity for violence may prevent conflicts more effectively than relying on community standards or legal institutions that don't exist in forms adequate for maintaining order among populations stressed beyond normal human tolerance. The informal justice system that develops operates through vigilante committees whose decisions reflect immediate emotions and personal interests rather than consistent application of principles that protect individual rights or promote long-term community stability and cooperative progress towards shared goals. Arguments escalate with frightening speed from practical disagreements about work arrangements or resource allocation to potentially fatal confrontations between people who lack the social skills and emotional restraint that normally allow peaceful resolution of conflicts that arise naturally in crowded conditions. Your sleep becomes lighter and more vigilant, as relaxing security awareness could invite problems from neighbors who face identical pressures and might conclude that survival justifies actions that would be unthinkable under circumstances where basic needs don't require constant attention and desperate measures. The few women present exist in vulnerable circumstances that make their safety dependent on male protection, that may prove unreliable when tested by conditions that eliminate normal social constraints and reduce human relationships to calculations about individual benefit versus collective welfare. Violence becomes normalized rather than exceptional, as regular occurrences of assault, theft, and intimidation create environment where such behaviors seem like natural responses to impossible circumstances rather than criminal activities that healthy communities would prevent through institutional mechanisms. The weight of isolation. Communication with family becomes increasingly difficult as the gap between your experience and their reality grows too wide for meaningful exchange of information about daily life that operates according to completely different principles and expectations about what normal existence should include. Letters home require careful editing to avoid describing conditions that would horrify recipients, while also avoiding false optimism about circumstances that show no sign of improvement through continued effort under conditions that seem designed to prevent success rather than reward hard work. The cost of postal services competes with basic survival expenses in calculations that rarely favor maintaining family connections over immediate physical needs, creating gradual separation from relationships that once provided emotional support and social identity, now threatened by geographic and experiential distance. Your previous identity becomes increasingly difficult to maintain when daily life requires behaviors and attitudes that contradict the person you used to be during comfortable existence, where moral choices didn't compete with survival necessities for priority in decision-making processes. News from civilized locations feels irrelevant to current reality, where local politics, community events, and social changes that once seemed important have been replaced by immediate concerns about basic survival that allow no mental space for broader consideration of world developments. Memories of normal social interaction become precious and fragile, like treasured objects that must be handled carefully to prevent damage from exposure to harsh realities that make previous relationships seem impossible to resume, even if return home becomes financially possible. The farmer's deteriorating condition serves as constant reminder of how isolation from proper medical care, adequate nutrition, and healthy living conditions affects human beings who can't escape before permanent damage occurs to bodies and minds that were functioning normally when this venture began. Your relationship with your own past becomes complicated as evidence accumulates that major life decisions were based on incomplete information about opportunities that sounded reasonable when presented through promotional materials, but prove unworkable when tested through actual experience under real conditions. The arithmetic of time. Months pass without meaningful progress toward any goal except continued survival in circumstances where achievement gets measured by avoiding complete disaster rather than accomplishing positive objectives that would justify the enormous investments of time, money, and health that this venture has required. Your daily routine reduces to mechanical repetition that serves no purpose beyond maintaining basic biological functions, while hope for improvement fades into vague possibilities that seem increasingly disconnected from actual experience in conditions that resist change through individual effort. Seasonal cycles provide the only reliable markers of time's passage, as weather changes create different types of misery rather than the pleasant variations that marked calendar progression during your previous life, where time moved toward goals rather than simply away from starting points. The banker's journal entries become shorter and more focused on immediate survival concerns rather than long-term analysis or personal reflection that requires mental energy now devoted entirely to practical problems that must be solved daily to prevent circumstances from deteriorating further. Planning beyond immediate necessities becomes impossible when current conditions change unpredictably and resources exist in quantities insufficient to provide security for more than brief periods that might be disrupted by illness, equipment failure, or economic catastrophe. Your concept of future adjusts to accommodate reality, where success means avoiding failure rather than achieving positive change, and where survival becomes worthy goal rather than minimum expectation for people who once planned to accomplish significant improvements in personal circumstances. The temporary nature that originally characterized this venture disappears as evidence accumulates that current conditions may represent permanent rather than transitional phase in life direction that seemed clearly defined when this journey began with specific objectives and reasonable timeline for their accomplishment. Memory of your previous life becomes increasingly dreamlike and difficult to reconcile with current reality, where comfortable existence seems so impossibly luxurious that recollections feel like stories about someone else's experience rather than your own recent history from just months ago. The democracy of decline. Every institution that attempts to develop within the Boomtown operates according to principles that favor immediate profit over long-term community welfare, creating services and businesses that exploit rather than serve populations who have no alternatives and therefore no ability to demand quality or fair treatment from providers. The few merchants who establish permanent operations understand that customer satisfaction becomes irrelevant when desperation drives all economic relationships and competition doesn't exist for essential goods and services that everyone needs, but which are available only through suppliers who can charge whatever prices the market will bear. Religious services, when they occur, adapt to accommodate congregations whose spiritual needs include justification for behaviors and circumstances that would challenge traditional moral teaching about proper Christian living and community responsibility toward vulnerable members of society. Educational opportunities don't exist for children who accompany families to mining regions, creating generational problems as young people develop without access to formal learning that civilized communities provide as foundation for social advancement and individual improvement through knowledge acquisition. Medical care operates through practitioners whose qualifications may be questionable, but whose services command premium prices because alternatives don't exist for treating illnesses and injuries that result predictably from living conditions that push human biological tolerance beyond reasonable limits. Legal representation becomes unnecessary luxury as formal court systems don't exist, and informal justice operates through mechanisms that favor physical strength or social connections rather than legal knowledge or procedural expertise that would matter in civilized jurisdictions. Banking services consist primarily of informal credit arrangements that trap borrowers in cycles of debt designed to ensure permanent obligation rather than temporary assistance that would help individuals improve their circumstances through sound financial management and productive investment. Your relationship with community institutions changes fundamentally as services that once seemed designed to help citizens now appear calculated to extract whatever wealth desperate people might accumulate while providing minimal value in return for premium prices that competitive markets would never support. The sound of entropy. The constant noise of construction and destruction creates acoustic environment where building and tearing down occur simultaneously as structures prove inadequate for their intended purposes, while new attempts at shelter and commerce rise from materials salvaged from previous failures. Your daily routine includes background awareness of hammering, sawing, and general industrial activity that never seems to result in meaningful improvement to overall living conditions, despite constant effort applied to construction projects that address symptoms rather than underlying problems. Conversations occur against soundtrack of commerce, argument, and general human activity that makes private discussion impossible and concentrates all communication into brief, practical exchanges about immediate concerns rather than personal reflection or emotional processing that requires quieter environments. The sounds of gambling, drinking, and violence blend into constant reminder of how men attempt to manage psychological pressure through behaviors that provide temporary relief while creating additional problems that compound existing difficulties with survival and social stability. Music becomes rare and generally melancholy when it occurs, expressing emotions that direct discussion would make too dangerous among people whose mental stability depends on avoiding full recognition of how completely their circumstances have deteriorated beyond reasonable hope for improvement. Sleep becomes difficult despite exhaustion, as noise levels never drop to ranges that allow proper rest, creating cumulative fatigue that affects decision-making and physical capability, while adding another layer of stress to existence already challenged by inadequate nutrition and constant vigilance. The absence of natural sounds that normally provide acoustic relief from human activity creates environment where mechanical and industrial noise dominates consciousness even during brief periods when you're not actively engaged in work or survival activities. Your tolerance for noise adjusts to accommodate conditions where quiet becomes impossible, luxury rather than normal expectation. Though the psychological cost of constant acoustic assault contributes to mental strain that affects everyone exposed to such conditions for extended periods without relief. The weight of reputation. Your identity within the boomtown develops according to factors that would have seemed irrelevant during your previous life, where social status reflected education, family background, and business success rather than immediate practical capabilities and willingness to accept degraded living conditions. Personal reputation becomes based on reliability in desperate circumstances rather than moral character or intellectual accomplishment, as community members evaluate each other according to standards that prioritize survival utility over the ethical considerations that normally govern social relationships. Trust develops slowly and remains fragile when everyone faces pressures that could make betrayal seem necessary for individual survival, creating social bonds that provide limited security while requiring constant vigilance about potential conflicts of interest between personal needs and group welfare. Your previous achievements and social connections become irrelevant in environment where current behavior under stress determines how others treat you, and where past success means nothing if present circumstances reveal inability to adapt to conditions that test different capabilities than civilized life requires. Relationships form around shared immediate interests rather than compatible personalities or common values, as survival necessities create temporary alliances that may dissolve when circumstances change or when cooperation no longer serves mutual benefit for people whose primary loyalty must be to personal continuation. The farmer's declining health affects his social position within the group, as his reduced productivity makes him potential burden rather than contributing member, though his previous reliability during earlier phases of the journey provides some protection against complete abandonment. Social hierarchy develops based on current usefulness rather than historical accomplishment, creating community structure that can change rapidly as circumstances shift and different skills become valuable for addressing whatever crisis currently threatens group survival or individual security. Your understanding of human nature adjusts to accommodate reality, where civilized behavior depends on institutional support that doesn't exist under conditions where basic survival requires attention and energy that would normally be available for maintaining social relationships and community responsibilities. The geography of despair. The physical layout of the boomtown develops without consideration for human welfare or community function, creating maze-like arrangements of structures that serve individual immediate needs while contributing to collective dysfunction that affects everyone forced to navigate through spaces designed by desperation rather than planning. Streets exist as informal pathways between buildings rather than planned transportation routes, creating navigation challenges that waste time and energy while contributing to general inefficiency that makes every simple task more difficult than necessary under circumstances that already demand maximum effort for basic survival. Drainage occurs through whatever natural channels existed before construction began, resulting in flooding during storms and standing water that creates breeding grounds for disease while making movement dangerous and unpleasant throughout areas where people must live and work. The boundaries between public and private space blur as individual property rights can't be enforced through legal mechanisms, creating situations where personal possessions and business operations overlap in ways that generate constant conflict over resource access and territorial control. Building density exceeds what the local environment can support through natural processes, creating concentrations of human activity that overwhelm water sources, waste disposal capacity, and other natural systems that healthy communities require for long-term sustainability. Fire hazards multiply as structures built from flammable materials crowd together without adequate space for emergency access, or firefighting equipment that could prevent individual accidents from becoming community disasters that destroy entire neighborhoods within minutes. Your daily movement through this environment requires constant attention to immediate physical hazards, while also maintaining awareness of social threats that could emerge from the desperation and instability that characterizes nearly every human interaction in spaces designed by necessity rather than thoughtful consideration. The absence of community planning creates cumulative problems that affect everyone while being solvable by no individual effort, demonstrating how quickly human settlements can devolve into conditions that make life more difficult for everyone rather than easier through cooperative social organization. The texture of seasons. Winter brings additional hardships that the Boomtown's inadequate infrastructure can't address, creating survival challenges that push already stressed populations beyond limits that seemed impossible to exceed during previous phases of gradual adaptation to increasingly difficult circumstances. Your shelter provides minimal protection against weather that would be manageable in properly constructed housing, but becomes life-threatening when experienced through canvas walls and improvised heating systems that consume scarce fuel while providing insufficient warmth for basic comfort and health. Food storage becomes a critical problem as freezing temperatures affect supplies that can't be protected adequately, while hunting opportunities decrease and transportation of goods becomes more expensive and unreliable due to weather conditions that disrupt normal commercial operations. Clothing proves inadequate for conditions that require protection from cold that penetrates every layer, while also maintaining mobility for work activities that can't stop simply because weather becomes uncomfortable or dangerous for people whose survival depends on continued productivity. The farmer's illness worsens dramatically as cold weather compounds his existing health problems while reducing access to medical care that becomes even more expensive and difficult to obtain when transportation and communication systems struggle with seasonal challenges. Fuel consumption increases dramatically for heating, cooking, and lighting that compete with each other for resources that exist in quantities insufficient to meet all essential needs simultaneously, forcing daily decisions about whether to maintain adequate warmth or prepare adequate food. Water sources freeze regularly, requiring time and fuel for melting that competes with other survival activities, while creating additional work that consumes energy already stretched beyond sustainable limits by conditions that demand constant effort for basic maintenance of life. Your daily routine adjusts to accommodate shorter daylight hours and weather delays that reduce productive work time while increasing the effort required to accomplish essential tasks that become more difficult and dangerous when performed under winter conditions that civilized communities normally manage through institutional support. The weight of recognition. The person you see reflected in still water or polished metal bears little resemblance to the individual who left home with carefully maintained appearance and confident expectations about returning wealthy and successful from venture that seemed reasonable when planned in comfortable circumstances. Physical changes mark the transformation from civilized merchant to survival-focused laborer, whose body shows evidence of malnutrition, constant exposure to harsh conditions, and physical stress that would concern medical professionals familiar with healthy human development and maintenance. Your clothing represents practical adaptations rather than social presentation, consisting of layers and modifications designed for survival utility, rather than the careful appearance that once reflected personal identity and social status within communities where such considerations mattered for business and social relationships. Mental processes adjust to focus on immediate survival concerns, rather than the complex planning and abstract thinking that characterized intellectual life when basic needs were satisfied automatically through community infrastructure that doesn't exist under current circumstances. Emotional responses adapt to accommodate daily exposure to conditions that would have been traumatic during your previous life, when psychological shock could be processed through social support systems and professional assistance that aren't available in communities organized around individual survival rather than collective welfare. Your speech patterns change to accommodate practical communication needs rather than social pleasantries, as conversation becomes tool for conveying essential information rather than maintaining relationships or expressing personality through elaborate verbal interaction that requires energy needed for more essential purposes. The values and priorities that once guided decision-making prove inadequate for circumstances where moral choices compete with survival necessities in ways that civilized communities normally prevent through institutional mechanisms that protect individuals from impossible ethical dilemmas. Your relationship with your own identity becomes complicated as evidence accumulates that fundamental personality characteristics depend on environmental support that allows expression of traits that can't survive under conditions where basic biological needs require constant attention and desperate measures for satisfaction. The mathematics of collapse. Your daily observations reveal the systematic nature of Boomtown failure as individual hardships aggregate into collective dysfunction that affects everyone, while being solvable by no single person's effort or good intentions under circumstances that overwhelm community capacity for cooperative problem solving. The banker's final calculations document complete economic breakdown, where normal relationships between work and compensation no longer function, creating conditions where increased effort produces decreased results, while basic survival costs continue escalating beyond most people's ability to pay through honest labor. Infrastructure deteriorates faster than it can be maintained or replaced, creating cumulative problems that affect sanitation, transportation, communication, and other essential services that civilized communities require for basic function, but which can't be sustained under current economic and social conditions. Population turnover accelerates as new arrivals replace departing residents who have concluded that success isn't possible under current circumstances, creating community instability that prevents development of institutional knowledge and cooperative relationships necessary for addressing systemic problems. The few businesses that achieve modest success do so through methods that exploit rather than serve community members, extracting wealth from desperate customers while contributing nothing to collective welfare or long-term sustainability of social and economic relationships. Medical problems multiply faster than treatment capacity, as living conditions create health challenges that exceed available professional resources while preventing the environmental improvements that would reduce disease and injury rates to manageable levels. Crime increases as legitimate economic opportunities prove inadequate for supporting basic survival, forcing people to choose between maintaining moral standards and maintaining physical existence in circumstances where legal alternatives don't provide sufficient income for essential needs. Your recognition of these patterns creates understanding that individual virtue and hard work can't overcome systematic problems that result from too many people competing for resources insufficient to support current population under conditions that favor exploitation over cooperation and short-term profit over long-term community development. The sound of ending. Conversations about the future become less frequent as evidence accumulates that current circumstances represent permanent rather than temporary conditions that will eventually improve through persistence and adaptation to challenges that initially seemed manageable with sufficient effort and determination. Your fellow residents discuss departure more often than success, sharing information about transportation costs, alternative destinations, and practical considerations for abandoning investments that have consumed years of life without producing promised results or reasonable hope for eventual improvement. The farmer's condition deteriorates to stages that require decisions about care that exceed group resources, forcing recognition that some consequences of this venture will persist regardless of whether mining activities eventually prove successful or whether return home becomes financially possible. Letters from home arrive less frequently and feel increasingly disconnected from reality, where normal concerns about community events, family developments, and social changes seem irrelevant to immediate survival challenges that allow no mental space for broader consideration of world beyond current circumstances. Arguments decrease in frequency and intensity as exhaustion eliminates even the energy required for conflict. Among people who have learned that disagreement wastes resources needed for basic survival while producing no useful results for anyone involved in disputes. The constant background noise of construction, commerce, and human activity begins to include more sounds of demolition and departure as temporary structures get abandoned and portable possessions get packed for transportation to other locations that might offer better opportunities. Music disappears almost entirely as instruments wear out, musicians depart, and social energy focuses entirely on practical activities that contribute directly to survival rather than entertainment or emotional expression that requires resources better devoted to essential needs. Your own voice changes when discussing personal plans, losing any remaining optimism about outcomes and replacing hopeful speculation with careful neutrality that avoids commitment to possibilities that experience suggests are unlikely to materialize regardless of continued effort or positive attitude. The weight of understanding. The realization settles gradually that you've witnessed the complete life cycle of a boomtown, from hopeful beginning through systematic dysfunction to inevitable collapse, providing education about human nature and social organization that civilized communities normally protect their members from experiencing directly. Your understanding of economics expands to include recognition of how easily normal relationships between work and reward can be disrupted when desperate populations accept conditions that favor suppliers over producers while eliminating competitive pressures that would normally protect consumers from exploitation. Social relationships prove more fragile than expected when institutional support disappears and individual survival competes with community welfare in ways that civilized society normally prevents through legal frameworks and cultural expectations that don't exist under current circumstances. The gap between promotional descriptions and actual conditions reveals systematic deception that may not have been intentionally malicious, but which produced devastating effects on people who made major life decisions based on incomplete and misleading information about opportunities that didn't exist in advertised forms. Your relationship with your own judgment changes as evidence accumulates that intelligent, careful people can make catastrophically wrong decisions when presented with information that sounds reasonable but proves disconnected from reality, that potential participants couldn't evaluate without direct experience. The farmer's illness demonstrates long-term consequences of exposure to conditions that seem temporarily tolerable but cause permanent damage to people who can't escape before their bodies and minds suffer irreversible harm from environments that exceed human biological tolerance. Human adaptability proves both remarkable and terrifying as you observe how quickly civilized people can adjust to circumstances that would have seemed impossible to survive, while simultaneously losing characteristics that originally defined their personality and social identity. The possibility of return home becomes complicated by recognition that the person who would return bears little resemblance to the individual who left, raising questions about whether resuming previous relationships and social roles will prove possible even if travel becomes financially feasible. The arithmetic of loss. Your final accounting reveals complete failure by any measure that would have seemed reasonable when this venture began, with calculations about investment, time, and effort that would produce sufficient wealth to justify sacrificing comfortable life and family relationships for pursuit of California opportunities. Everything you owned before departing home has been consumed by expenses that proved far greater than anticipated, while income from mining activities never approached levels that promotional materials suggested would result from honest work under conditions that turned out to be fundamentally different from advertised descriptions. Health costs continue accumulating as your body shows signs of permanent damage from months of inadequate nutrition, constant stress, and exposure to working conditions that civilized medical practice would recognize as dangerous to basic biological function and long-term physical capability. Time invested represents years that could have been spent maintaining family relationships, developing business connections, and participating in community activities that contribute to normal human development, rather than the reduction to survival concerns that eliminates personal growth and social sophistication. The social costs include damage to family relationships that may prove irreparable, as communication becomes impossible across gaps between civilized expectation and survival reality that family members can't understand because their society protects them from such extreme circumstances. Your relationship with hope adjusts to accommodate recognition that optimism can become dangerous when it prevents realistic assessment of circumstances that require practical response rather than positive thinking about outcomes that evidence suggests won't occur through individual effort. The knowledge gained through this experience includes understanding of how quickly human civilization can disappear when institutional support fails, and how easily people can be deceived about opportunities that sound reasonable but prove unworkable when tested through actual experience under real conditions. You fall asleep wondering whether the education gained through witnessing social collapse and personal transformation justifies the price paid for learning that human nature includes capabilities for both remarkable adaptation and devastating self-deception when hope competes with evidence about what's actually possible under current circumstances. You've seen how quickly hope can transform into something uglier than despair. The Boomtown promised opportunity, but delivered only new and creative ways to lose everything you thought you had left. When civilized men are pushed beyond their limits, civilization itself becomes the first casualty. But this isn't the end of the story. There's one more lesson the California gold rush has to teach about what happens when even the boomtowns fail, when even the illusion of community collapses, and when men are forced to face the final, terrible arithmetic of their choices. Join us next time for the conclusion of our gold rush journey, where we'll discover that sometimes the most dangerous thing isn't failing to achieve your dreams, it's finally understanding what those dreams actually cost.